In the quiet corners of history, where dark secrets often remain shrouded in silence, there exists a chapter that few dare to explore. It is a time when fear held sway over a nation's heart, when justice was often a cruel and merciless force. The Edo period in Japan, spanning from 1603 to 1868, was a time of peace, prosperity, and societal order. Yet beneath the veneer of calm, the brutal methods of punishment reserved for criminals, rebels, and the disobedient were nothing short of horrifying. Imagine a time when the mere act of speaking out of turn or committing a crime could lead to a punishment so severe it would make even the most hardened criminals tremble in fear. Death, in most cases, was not the end of suffering. It was merely the culmination of unimaginable torment, designed not only to punish, but to send a chilling message to society. Disobey, and you will suffer in ways beyond comprehension. At the heart of this era were the samurai, who upheld the law with an iron fist. Their code, Bushido, emphasized honor, loyalty, and justice, but the methods they used to enforce this code often strayed far from mercy. Criminals, once caught, faced a range of punishments that left no room for dignity. Execution was the ultimate fate, but the road to death was often paved with unimaginable agony. Among the many gruesome methods of torture employed in the Edo period, seppuku, ritual disembowelment, is perhaps the most famous, but it was far from the only method used to extract confessions or mete out punishment. The practice of seppuku was often reserved for samurai, whose honor was bound to their life and death. However, for the common people, the fate was much darker, much more cruel. The tortures they endured before death were meant not only to extract confessions, but to make their final moments as excruciating as possible. One of the most harrowing methods of execution during this period was toshi, decapitation by sword. While this form of punishment may seem straightforward, the process was laden with rituals that stretched the suffering of the condemned. The executioner, highly trained in the art of decapitation, would strike with such precision that the head would be severed in one blow. However, the suffering didn't always end with the blade. For those whose crimes were particularly heinous, the punishment would be prolonged. In some cases, victims were disemboweled before the final blow, their entrails spilling out as a grim reminder of the consequences of betrayal or crime. But perhaps the most terrifying and excruciating form of torture was Kubi-uchi, the method of hanging by the neck until dead. Unlike a simple hanging, this punishment involved hoisting the criminal up and allowing them to dangle, gasping for air until their body was on the brink of collapse. This torturous wait would last for what seemed like an eternity. With every minute that passed, the condemned person would experience excruciating pain, their breath growing shallow, their vision clouded, and their body on the verge of giving way. As if this wasn't enough, the Edo authorities also employed the use of suicide pits, or Gōshin, deep pits in which criminals were thrown and left to suffocate. These pits were often used for those who had committed particularly heinous acts, or for those who were seen as a threat to the stability of the ruling class. These pits were dark, confined spaces, devoid of any light or air. Those who were thrown into them were often left to die a slow, agonizing death, with no one to witness their suffering. It was a punishment designed to break the spirit before the body was allowed to perish. For those lucky enough to avoid such horrific methods, their fate was often no less dreadful. Sokushinbutsu, a Buddhist practice wherein monks would slowly starve themselves to death to achieve enlightenment, was sometimes forced upon those who had committed crimes that the authorities felt were worthy of such a gruesome punishment. The person would be sealed in a tomb, only given minimal food and water, and left to die of hunger and dehydration. The process could take weeks, with the person's body deteriorating before death mercifully took hold. The authorities in the Edo period didn't just punish criminals for their deeds, they sought to instill fear into the masses. Every punishment Every execution was designed to demonstrate the power of the state, to remind the people that their lives were controlled by those in power. The suffering of a single person was meant to be a lesson for the thousands who would witness or hear about their demise. Yet what made these tortures even more horrifying was the lack of empathy, the complete disregard for human life. Society had conditioned its people to accept these brutal punishments as the norm, to view them as necessary for maintaining order in a chaotic world. Those who broke the law were viewed not as individuals deserving of mercy, but as threats to the very fabric of the nation, a threat that had to be eradicated through force and pain. As time wore on, these punishments became so extreme that even the samurai, once so revered for their honor and discipline, began to question the morality of the system they had sworn to uphold. The idea that death, in its most horrific form, was the only way to ensure order eventually began to erode the values that had once held Japanese society together. The brutal, blood-stained history of the Edo period's punishments eventually faded into the shadows, with the wounds of its victims slowly buried by time. But the legacy of those forgotten tortures is not easily erased. The truth about these punishments, the suffering they inflicted, and the families left in ruins still lingers, hidden in the dark recesses of history. As Japan modernized and entered the Meiji period, these violent practices were abolished, but the scars they left on the collective psyche of the nation would never truly fade. We will explore how these torturous methods were eventually buried by history, the cultural shift that led to their eradication, and the untold stories of those who perished in the name of justice. We will uncover the truth about the forgotten punishments of the Edo period, and why they continue to haunt the legacy of Japan's past. The end of the Edo period marked a significant turning point in Japan's history. As the Tokugawa shogunate came to a close, so too did the brutal and unforgiving methods of punishment that had been the hallmark of the era. With the dawn of the Meiji period came a new age of modernization and reform. Yet, despite the societal changes, the dark legacy of the Edo period's tortures was not so easily erased. The Meiji Restoration, which began in 1868, brought an end to the feudal system and sought to establish a modernized Japan. As the country opened up to Western influences, a new legal system was established, one that embraced more humane methods of punishment and sought to bring the country in line with global norms. The new government abolished many of the Edo period's brutal forms of execution and torture, replacing them with imprisonment and more conventional forms of capital punishment. The katana, sword, that had once been a symbol of the samurai's authority, was now mostly relegated to ceremonial purposes. However, while the laws and systems of punishment were changing, the memories of the old ways still haunted the Japanese. The suffering endured by countless men, women, and children under the hands of the authorities during the Edo period left deep scars in the collective memory. People. The terror of knowing that a single mistake could lead to unspeakable torture or a slow, agonizing death was a fear ingrained in the psyche of the population for generations. But the story does not end with the rise of the Meiji government. For many years after the Edo period's official end, the brutal punishments that were once used by the shogunate continued to be a subject of hushed whispers and hidden accounts. The government's attempt to sweep the past under the rug was, at best, a temporary solution. The tortures, while no longer in practice, lived on in the minds of those who had witnessed or experienced them firsthand. As Japan modernized, there were efforts to reconcile the darker chapters of its past with the new vision of a progressive nation. But the question remained, how could a society that had once used such extreme measures of control and punishment embrace a new future without acknowledging the pain and suffering of its past? In this new era of change, historical revisionism began to take shape. The brutality of the Edo period's punishments was often minimized or ignored. Schools, which now focused on teaching the new ideology of the Meiji government, glossed over the violence of the past, portraying it as a necessary part of the country's development. The painful stories of those who had endured Kubi-uchi, Toshi, and Gōshin were left untold, buried under the weight of Japan's drive for modernization. However, some individuals and scholars began to seek out the truth, digging deep into the forgotten past of Japan's feudal era. These historians and researchers unearthed long-lost documents, some of which detailed the harrowing methods of execution and the personal stories of those who had suffered under them. For the first time, the public was given a glimpse into the horrors that had been concealed for so long. Books, articles, and even museum exhibitions began to shed light on the tortures that had been part of Japan's dark history. Yet despite the growing awareness of this tragic past, the country's collective consciousness remained reluctant to fully confront the extent of the cruelty. The lingering shame of a society that had once employed such brutal measures of punishment left many reluctant to discuss these atrocities in public. The old ways were seen as a stain on the nation's image, something that Japan had left behind in favor of progress and modernization. In the face of this silence, the memory of the victims remained. Those who had perished in the torture pits, who had suffered beneath the hands of executioners, whose final breaths had been drawn in agony, were not forgotten. Their stories, however, became more elusive over time, as Japan's modern image of prosperity and peace began to take precedence over the dark history of the past. Even today, the shadow of the Edo period's tortures still lingers in the corners of Japan as historical memory. While the country is now known for its technological advancements, cultural influence, and peaceful diplomacy, the echoes of its violent past can still be heard in the quiet moments of reflection. Museums dedicated to the Edo period and its infamous punishments now stand as somber reminders of a time when fear was a constant companion, and death was often just the beginning of suffering. In the midst of Japan's modern identity, the stories of the victims remain largely forgotten. There are no monuments to those who perished in the Gōshin pits, no commemorations for the souls lost to the Toshi executions. These individuals, once considered expendable by the ruling class, are now lost to history, their names unknown, their lives erased from the collective narrative. But the suffering they endured is not easily forgotten. It lives on in the shadows, a haunting reminder of the price of justice in an unforgiving era. Yet, perhaps, the most significant lesson we can learn from this dark chapter of Japan's history is the importance of compassion and mercy in the face of punishment. The Edo period's legacy serves as a cautionary tale of what can happen when a society values order and control over human dignity. It reminds us that justice, when administered without empathy, can easily turn into cruelty. Today, Japan is a nation that has transformed itself from the ashes of its violent past into a global leader in peace and innovation. The lessons of the Edo period's tortures are buried deep, but they are not forgotten. They serve as a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always the potential for change. The shadows of the past, though long cast aside, still linger in the recesses of memory, teaching us to never forget the suffering that has come before and to never repeat the mistakes of history. As Japan continues to evolve, the tragic legacy of the Edo period's punishments remains an essential part of its story, a reminder that in the search for justice, mercy must always prevail.